It is me, Loki.
What you just saw there is a new form of auto-attack cancelling. This was discovered by Burning Flare X on Reddit. The original video is down below. I'm showing you this because it has a slight impact on what we're talking about in this video. Also, shoutouts to The Mad Fool on Reddit, who brought me onto this path. His original comment and his original calculations are linked below. The rest is stuff I did with CredCalc, so shoutouts to Cred and Merl as well. This video will contain quite a lot of numbers, so sorry about that, but it is necessary as these numbers may drastically change the way you play and build some characters. Let's begin with that ridiculous damage number that I did there. It was obviously against an Odin bot, so you wouldn't have the same number in a normal game, but what happened there is still very interesting. This new type of auto-attack cancelling basically changes the way you should use your abilities on certain characters. Previously, auto-attack cancelling was usually used to shorten the delay between your auto-attack, the ability after it, and the next auto-attack. It was also used to increase the damage of Hydra's Lament, as the first hit in your attack chain usually has 1.0 damage, while later hits often have lower damage values like 0.5 or 0.75. What you can do, and what was shown in the video, however, is attack until you're at the point of the attack chain where you want the bonus damage from Hydra's Lament. Then stop attacking until the attack animation has completely finished, and then use your ability and attack again right after. In case of Loki, this is quite significant. Your attack chain is 1, 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, 1.5. If you manage to proc Hydras on the 1.5 part of the chain, it deals significantly more damage. Even more when you crit on that hit of the chain. And this brings us to the main topic of this video. Crit versus pen. This is specifically for characters that utilize both auto attacks as well as abilities. There are 3 characters in the game that utilize both to an extent that it makes sense for them to consider this. The first one obviously being Loki, as shown in the example. The second one being Awilix. And the third one being Susanoo, who will be released shortly. There are a few other characters that can make use of this, for example Raven or Thanatos, but typically they go for other build styles that don't utilize the hybrid damage, so it's not as important for them. Now, let's take a look at the charts. There are a ton of numbers here, and if you want to go through all of them and check all of them, feel free to pause the video right here and check for yourself. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail here, because it doesn't really make sense after looking at the good ones compared to the bad ones to check all the bad ones in detail as well. If you want to do so, feel free to check them out right here. For some background, the tables are basically damage numbers with the different builds on a level 20 Loki, the standard build on him being Transcendence, Warrior Tabi, Jotunn's Wrath, and Titan's Bane, plus 2 situational items, plus sometimes replacing Transcendence for another item, versus an level 20 Isis with 3 different setups. 1, no defense items, so the base 63 physical protections. 2, an Isis with Dynasty Platehelm. And 3, an Isis with Breastplate of Valor. Also, don't be confused by the 103 up there. That's actually 93 in terms of Dynasty Platehelm. Just a typo up in the numbers. The calculations are correct. The 3 builds that we're mainly going to be dealing with are the ones which lines go through all the way, as those turned out to be better than the rest. In some regards, at least. So here's the core build that everyone should be familiar with, especially when you're playing Loki. Warrior Tabi, Jotunn's Wrath, Titan's Bane, and Transcendence. Let's first talk about the options that were ruled out or considered impractical by me in these scenarios. Brawler's Beatstick and the Crusher as additional last items. These items actually give you the highest ability damage. However, it makes a lot more sense to get some extra cooldown reduction in order to get your abilities off more often. The next option is Brawler's Beatstick and Stone-Cutting Sword. Do not build this on Loki. It makes sense on Awilix, and it will probably make sense on Susanoo as well, but do not build this on Loki for ability damage. Comparing it to the Crusher, which starts off with 20 flat pen, it takes you 7 hits to actually reach the same amount of damage, simply because you start off with 20 less pen, then on the next hit you actually have 30 less pen, then you have 30 less pen in total still, then you have 20 less pen, and so on. You get the idea. It's not worth it for the damage. The reasons for Stone-Cutting Sword are movement speed and physical defense for boxing. Loki doesn't need that. Awilix can use that very well, as she generally utilizes defense better than Loki does, and so will Susanoo, I assume, given from how its kit looks like so far. If you need burst, and if your damage comes on early abilities, as they do with Loki, different from Awilix, who does 2 auto attacks before she even uses Feather Step, then Stone Cutting Sword should not be an option. Running Brawler's Beatstick and the Crusher and replacing Transcendence with Hydra's Lament actually works surprisingly well. This also opens some new opportunities, as you can now build into more damage items early on, allowing you to aggress more instead of spending all your time in lane and stack. It gives you some mana issues in return for some CDR, and the raw damage of some auto attacks will not be as high. If, however, you are able to utilize Hydra's Lament properly, this can actually outdamage a Transcendence build. It greatly depends on if you make use of the new auto-cancel technique or not. The reason I don't go into detail here is because the numbers are actually quite similar to the Transcendence build. You can look them up, the calculations are in the beginning, but I don't think it makes too much sense to talk about it in detail in this video, as the numbers are nearly the same. Brawler's Beatstick and Malice. This build could have made it because it's extremely good. At the same time, it's extremely hard to calculate because Malice's passive on its own is hard enough to calculate, and the extra damage that it provides is very luck dependent because of the 20% crit chance. If you want to go single crit, even with the Hydra's buff, Malice seems to be the better option, as the general DPS is quite a fair bit higher than Deathbringer and the item is cheaper. However, there are some circumstances and some tricks that lead to Deathbringer and Malice potentially being a more interesting option to look at and making it a little more logical and easy to calculate, because gambling on the 20% crit chance in terms of calculations can really mess up your game. This is definitely not a bad option, and even in the Mad Fool's calculations, the damage roughly averages out the same as the pen build, but it's a little less consistent, so to speak. This leaves us with 3 options to really consider. You see those at the bottom. Number 1, Brawler's Beatstick, or the Crusher, depending on what your goal is, and Hydra's Lament. This is probably the most common one, the high pen build with the bonus from Hydra's Lament that really helps you split push and gives you high ability damage. As you can see, the ability damage should be the highest value. There is some weird glitch for the other 2 that gives them a higher value, but the right value should be the one on the right. In an ability rotation where you use your 1, 3 and ultimate on a target, the pen build will roughly have 200 to 300 more damage than the other 2 builds. This may sound like much at first, but we'll get into that. So, the ability damage is a fair bit higher. At the same time, the DPS from auto attacks is a fair bit lower. No matter which amount of defense we're talking here, the other builds have between 150 and 250 more DPS. Talking about DPS, let's take a look at the double crit build. Malice plus Deathbringer. At first you may think this is terrible because, you know, Loki needs pen, Loki leads to split push, blah 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 blah. We've heard it all. Yes, but no. This build is primarily aiming at taking down players, that's for sure. This build allows you to box better because you have more DPS, and it overall is not geared towards primarily split pushing. That doesn't make it bad at split pushing. It still has a decent amount of power. The only thing you really lack is the bonus from the Crusher, which you're not gonna get, but that's okay. It's not the best split pushing build, but if you want to split push with this, it's still okay. What do you get in return? You get lower ability damage, roughly 300 actually, which is not that great. 200, 300 less ability damage. But you get a lot more DPS. And this DPS is so much more significant than many may realize. The DPS, the damage per second, in this build obviously comes from auto attacks. Looking at the difference in auto attacks, the difference between the builds is huge. A single crit has between 250 and 350 extra damage compared to the pen build when it happens, depending on the defenses, obviously. You have a 40% crit chance, so a crit is not that unlikely. Also, people may bring up the argument that Loki deals most of his damage from abilities, but 2 of his abilities are actually tied with an auto attack that can also crit. If you cancel abilities right with him, you will have at least 4 to 5 auto attacks in your attack chain before the enemy is actually dead. In that sense, it's very likely for you to crit at least once. The downside to this build, aside of not being as efficient at split pushing, is the price. If you're behind, you're probably better off getting Pen simply because it's a fair bit cheaper. Also, look at the second calculation regarding ability chains. I've done a calculation with 4 auto attacks, then an aim strike, which resets the chain back to 1. Unfortunately, CredCalc doesn't assume the new auto attack cancel. So, in the end, this is a chain with 2 assumed crits, which is not unlikely on 5 auto attacks, and it's exactly how many crits it should be. And this chain alone outdamages the Pen build by far if you look at the number there. This brings us to the last build, which is basically made possible by the realization that crit can actually work pretty well on Loki, which is replacing Trends for Hydras once again. As you can see in the numbers down below, you will still lose some DPS, which sucks. At the same time, this build provides you with so much. It negates one of the downsides of the previous build, which is the lack of a second CDR item. It allows you to decently split push because you still have a decent amount of pen and you get those extra strong basics. On top of that, it has the potential to do crazy bursts if you abuse the new attack chain technique. If you do your attack chain down to the last 0.5 hit, then use Hydras, and then are a little bit lucky and land a crit, it will get the extra damage from Hydras. It will do 1.5 of the normal damage. It will do the extra damage from a Deathbringer on top of that. And as far as I know, that's actually multiplied. And then you will have the Malice dot on top of that as well. I cannot show this in the CredCalc calculations yet because they don't assume an attack chain continuing after using an ability. So you have to trust my word here. But in the end, this should be stronger than anything we have seen in this regard so far. And it should probably outburst a pen build as well, simply due to the strength of crit. This build is not perfect for split pushing. And while it is a little bit cheaper than the one with Transcendence, it loses a little bit of boxing power when it comes to straight up hitting an enemy in the face. But the attack chain resets should make it so strong that it should actually outdamage pretty much everything else. And I think that's a pretty crazy realization right there. This build also allows early aggression, as once again, you don't have to build Transcendence and stuff like that. So really, really cool in my opinion. This doesn't mean that the other builds are useless or that you shouldn't build pen anymore. It's all situational. If you just want to split push, build pen. If you don't have enough gold, build pen. If you don't want to gamble at all, build pen. But if you want to maximize your damage to the highest extent possible, then the other 2 crit options might just be better. You can do the hybrid option in between as well. Like I said, it theoretically has the highest DPS, but it's much more of a gamble and it's much less reliable. In that case, you can still consider trading out Transcendence for Hydras just to get those extra procs off. But then again, it's a lot less likely to get those procs off. This is how it works in theory. Obviously, you have to learn how to utilize everything in the build properly to make it work better. And I'm sure I've forgotten some of the things I wanted to say in this video because it's just so much new information that I had no idea about before. And I don't think many people did because so far the opinion on double crit on Loki has been very consistently against it. The same thing obviously applies to Awilix and Susano as well. Regarding Awilix, it's mostly about the pen versus crit part. Crit may just be better in more situations than it was obvious before. She can't do too much with the attack cancelling, and Stone Cutting Sword is very good on her, so you don't want to avoid that. With Susanoo, it's even more important. He can abuse the Hydra's crit technique to the max, simply because he has the ability to do 2 auto attacks, then use his 1, then proc Hydra with it and potentially get a crit, and do that over and over again until the 1 runs out, which is 3 loops, because you can always hit 2 auto attacks in between. The amount of damage that can come out of that with crits and Hydras is just crazy. The reason I mainly used Loki here is because we already have his numbers and his numbers are in crit calc, so it's just easier to calculate, whereas Awilix just functions a little different in general. One last thing to note, with the upcoming patch, Bloodforge will be nearly as strong as Transcendence in terms of power, while being slightly more expensive and providing you with lifesteal and other benefits. If you don't need the MP5, Bloodforge might be a very good pickup as well. Same goes for Wind Demon, which just gives you different kinds of benefits. It takes away from your damage, but it can be really good as well. Sorry for this very long video. I hope this was still informative. Thank you guys for watching. Dukesloth out.